The biting wind of the early morning howled through the iron bars. Arthur Art Mendez, 78, shivered inside the old rusty dog kennel placed in the most remote corner of the backyard. His gnarled fingers, once strong enough to raise walls and build dreams, now barely managed to close, trying to retain what little warmth remained. The thin, worn blanket over his hunched shoulders did little against the cold that seeped beneath his skin. 30 yards away, through the illuminated windows of the mansion, Art could see silhouettes moving. Occasional laughter escaped like daggers into the darkness where he was confined. His son, Richard, raised a glass in a toast. His daughter-in-law, Carol, poured another round of wine. The aroma of the freshly prepared meal drifted through the air, reaching him as an additional torment to his empty stomach. "Dad always liked this Cabernet," Art mumbled to himself as a solitary tear ran down his wrinkled face. He closed his eyes and let the memories take him far away from that kennel. He saw himself young again, carrying bricks under the scorching sun, saving every penny. He remembered his wife, Claudia, always by his side, counting coins at the kitchen table. "One day we'll have our own house, my love," he'd say. And he delivered, brick by brick, sweat after sweat. He built not just the house, but a small empire. A respected construction company, loyal clients, a decent life earned with his own hands. When Claudia passed away, succumbing to a swift cancer 5 years ago, something broke inside him. "I can't leave our son helpless," he thought. Richard, their only son, had always been spoiled. He never understood the value of hard work, growing up reaping the fruits of the trees his father had planted. Still, Art wanted to protect him. He transferred the construction company, the house, the savings, everything into his son's name. "Take good care of our legacy," he pleaded. The first week was normal. The second, his room was moved to the ground floor. The following month, to the back of the house, then to a damp storage room. His meals dwindled, his medications disappeared, his money vanished, his clothes were reduced to rags, his pleas were ignored, until one morning he woke up being dragged outside. "This is your place now, old man." Richard pointed to the old doghouse, now transformed into a makeshift cage. "From now on, you don't enter my house anymore." His small hands gripped the curtain fabric tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Every night, it was the same secret ritual. Waiting for his parents to fall asleep, opening the window without making a sound, and watching over his grandfather from a distance, making sure he was still breathing. The boy wiped away a furtive tear. He remembered the times when Grandpa Art took him fishing, told him stories of when he built huge buildings and taught him how to make paper boats. Now he wasn't even allowed to mention his grandfather's name. "If I catch you talking to that useless old man again, you'll go to bed without dinner for a week," his father had threatened, the last time he caught him taking a glass of water to his grandfather. A noise in the hallway made Mikey quickly move away from the window. Heavy footsteps approached. He jumped into bed and pretended to sleep, his heart racing. The door opened with a creak. "Mikey?" His father's voice was cold. "I know you're awake." The next morning, while his parents left for a business meeting, Mikey ran down the stairs and found Delia, the housekeeper who had worked in the house for decades, since the days when his grandfather owned it. "Delia, I need your help," he whispered. The gray-haired lady looked around nervously. "What is it, boy? You know I can't get involved." She had been trying secretly to bring food and water to Art whenever possible, but it was risky. Richard had already threatened to fire her more than once. "Mr. Mendez was a good boss for 30 years, Delia murmured. "Gave me a job when no one else would. Paid for my daughter's college, and now—" Her voice trailed off. Mikey held her wrinkled hands. "We're going to save him, Delia. There has to be a way." And despite the cold, the hunger, and the humiliation, he felt a small spark of hope ignite in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was still salvation. Mikey ran through the streets of the neighborhood with determination in his eyes. His school backpack bumped against his back as his small feet moved towards the old Mendes construction headquarters where his grandfather had worked for decades. Mr. Paul, Art's former partner, might be able to help. He had to help. A drop of sweat trickled down the boy's temple. He had lied to the school, saying he was sick and needed to go home. He didn't have much time before someone noticed his absence. His legs burned with the effort, but the image of his grandfather locked in the kennel gave him the strength to continue. He arrived breathless at the modernized construction company building. The security guards at the entrance cast suspicious glances at the sweaty and disheveled boy. Mikey swallowed hard and adjusted his uniform shirt. "I need to speak with Mr. Paul," he announced, trying to sound older than his 10 years. "It's urgent." "What are you doing here alone, young man?" "I tried to visit him several times, but Richard always said he was sick or traveling or not feeling well." His voice faltered. "How could I have been so blind? This is a crime." "I didn't say I wasn't going to help," he finally said. "I said we need to be smart." He turned to Mikey. "Your father and I have an important meeting tomorrow. He'll be gone all day. It's your chance to get proof. Hide it and record everything." He also felt the weight of responsibility on his young shoulders. He knew he was taking a risk. If his parents found out, he shuddered, remembering the last spanking he had received for disobeying. The marks on his back hadn't completely faded yet, but he thought of his grandfather alone in the cold and pushed away the fear. Some sacrifices were worth it. The morning dawned gray, as if the sky itself shared Mikey's apprehension. A storm was brewing on the horizon. The boy watched his parents leave for the business meeting, the imported car disappearing around the bend in the road. As soon as they were gone, he ran to his room and retrieved the small camera hidden under the loose floorboard. "It's going to work," he murmured to himself like a mantra. "It has to work. If your parents find out..." "Grandpa, wake up!" "Trust me." In front of the camera, she confirmed the mistreatment she witnessed daily. "That's it, Grandpa," Mikey said, finishing the recording. "Now I'm going to take this to someone who can help." Mikey quickly put the camera in his pocket and promised to return soon with help. He ran into the house, soaked. He needed to change and get to Paul's office as soon as possible. When he entered his room, however, he felt that something was wrong. The window, which he was sure he had left closed, was open, the curtains swaying with the wind and rain coming in. Looking for this? Richard was sitting on the boy's bed, twirling the small camera between his fingers. Beside him, Paul avoided looking him in the eye. "The meeting was cancelled," Richard explained with a cruel smile. "And I found Mr. Paul on his way here, very eager to tell me about your little heroic plan. I can't risk it." The old man tried to stay above the muddy water that was accumulating, while his bones protested against the penetrating cold. Each drop that hit the metal sounded like a clock, ticking away the time he had left. Inside the house, Mikey screamed as his father dragged him by the arm down the stairs towards the back door. "Dad, please, it's raining. Grandpa will die out there." Carol, his wife, watched the scene from the staircase, a glass of wine in her hand, without showing any reaction. "You chose your side, Mikey," Richard declared, throwing the door open violently. The wind and rain flooded the hallway. "Now you'll experience the company you cherish so much." The elderly housekeeper fell, hitting her head against the wall. She didn't get up. "Delia!" Mikey shouted, trying to break free. Richard dragged him outside, through the torrential rain, to the kennel where Art huddled. He opened the padlock and pushed the boy inside, locking it again violently. "Enjoy each other's company," he shouted above the noise of the storm. "Maybe then you'll learn to appreciate the roof I provide." "We need to help her, Grandpa," Mikey shouted, reaching his arm through the bars, trying to reach the old woman. Art coughed violently, his body trembling. "I can't." "Stand up, son. I'm going to get us out of here, I promise." Mikey looked at the house, where the lights indicated that his parents were comfortably settled, probably having dinner. He remembered a news story he had seen weeks ago. The new mayor of the city, Edward "Ed" Martins, had launched a campaign against elder abuse. He had even released a direct hotline number for reporting. With his fingers trembling from the cold, Mikey dialed the number that by some miracle he still remembered. Elder Abuse Emergency Hotline. A female voice answered after 3 rings. "Please," Mikey whispered, "my grandfather is dying. We're locked in a kennel, in the rain." But for the first time in a long time, a small light of hope ignited in the darkness. Sirens cut through the night. Red and blue lights danced through the rain, casting ghostly shadows across the muddy yard. Mikey, semi-conscious from the cold and exhaustion, raised his head from Art's chest when he heard the noise. "Grandpa, they're coming to save us," he whispered, shaking the old man slightly, who didn't respond. "Grandpa? Open up immediately. My grandfather is very sick." An officer approached them, accompanied by a woman in a suit who introduced herself as a prosecutor. "Richard Mendez," the officer announced. "You are under arrest for elder abuse, unlawful imprisonment, attempted negligent homicide, and child abuse." The old man asked to stay in the backyard. He said he wanted to be close to nature, and the boy was being punished for lying, that's all. In addition, Mayor Ed Martins is personally following this case. "I'm going to take care of you." At the hospital, they separated him from Art. Doctors rushed around, emergency teams were called in. Mikey was taken to another section where they treated his hypothermia and the bruises from the previous assaults. A kind social worker named Deborah stayed by his side the whole time. "You were very brave," she said, holding his hand. "You saved your grandfather's and Delia's lives. The doctors are doing everything they can. Your grandfather has severe pneumonia, malnutrition, and hypothermia, but he seems to be a fighter, like you. It will be a long and difficult recovery, but he is surprisingly resilient for someone who's been through what he's been through." Vincent's hospital exuded that characteristic aroma of antiseptic and weak coffee. Mikey walked down the hallway of the ICU, his footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor. 2 weeks had passed since the rescue, and every day after school he came to visit his grandfather. The machines beeped steadily beside the bed where Art rested. Tubes and wires connected him to monitors that recorded every beat of his fragile heart. The doctor had explained to Mikey that his grandfather had suffered severe pneumonia, aggravated by chronic malnutrition and prolonged exposure to the cold. His body, already weakened by age, was fighting with all its might. "Hi, Grandpa," Mikey greeted, sitting in the chair next to the bed. He placed on the bedside table the drawing he had made in art class, a colorful house with an old man and a boy holding hands in the garden. "I brought you another drawing, for when you wake up." "How is he today?" she asked, approaching. Mikey shrugged, the sadness visible in his eyes. "The same. Dr. Miller said he can hear, even sleeping like this. So I talked to him. He only knew that they were detained, awaiting trial. The charges were serious: elder abuse with aggravating family ties, torture, unlawful imprisonment, neglect, child abuse." "Will I have to talk in court?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Probably yes, later on," Deborah replied gently, "but you won't be alone. I'll be there, and a psychologist assigned by the court as well. Your voice is very important in this case, Mikey." He took the wrinkled hand in his, careful not to dislodge the needle from the IV drip. "Did Dr. Miller say Grandpa will wake up?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Deborah hesitated. The doctors weren't optimistic. Art's body had suffered too much. At 78, recovering from such an ordeal was almost a miracle. But how to tell that to a 10-year-old boy who had already lost so much? "Your grandfather is fighting, Mikey. He's strong. You know," she said, trying to distract him, "Mayor Ed Martins came to visit you yesterday while you were at school. He was very impressed with your courage. Grandpa would be proud. He's going to be okay, isn't he?" The last glimpse Mikey had of his grandfather was of his fragile figure being surrounded by white coats, while someone shouted, "Charge the defibrillator!" "Please don't let him die." Miller came out of the room, his face grave but with a slight sigh of relief. "We managed to stabilize him," he announced. "It was close, but he's a fighter. He's never given up on anything in his life." Mikey approached the bed and, without asking permission, carefully climbed in beside his grandfather, lying next to him, as he had so many times when he was little, during the stormy nights when he ran to the old man's room seeking protection. "Grandpa," he whispered in his ear, "I know you're tired. I know it hurts, but please don't go. I promise I'll take care of you. We're going to live together again, and I'll make the coffee the way you like it, with plenty of sugar. I'll read the newspaper to you every morning. Please, Grandpa, I need you." I'm not going to leave him alone now. The Mendez case had become a symbol of the fight against elder abuse and neglect across the country, thanks to the mayor's intervention and media coverage. Mikey, dressed in a blue button-down shirt that Deborah had bought especially for the occasion, sat in the first row. Delia beside him held his hand firmly. The boy stared at the prosecution table, where District Attorney Sarah Lewis organized a stack of documents. At the opposite table, his parents awaited the start of the session. Richard kept his eyes down, while Carol occasionally glanced in her son's direction, as if expecting some sign of compassion. Mikey looked away every time that happened. A month had passed since the night of the rescue, a month of anguish, hope, and small victories. The biggest of these had occurred 3 days after the crisis in the hospital, when Art finally opened his eyes. Mikey remembered that moment perfectly. He was reading aloud to his grandfather from a comic book, trying to maintain the routine he had created of spending every free moment in the hospital. And then Superman flew faster than light and, he narrated animatedly when he noticed a movement. His grandfather's eyes, previously closed, were now staring at him with a mixture of confusion and recognition. "Grandpa," Mikey called, dropping the magazine. "Grandpa, nurse." "He's awake!" Judge Thompson, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, entered the room, bringing Mikey back to the present. Everyone stood up in respect. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. District Attorney Lewis began her argument, presenting the evidence collected. Testimonies from neighbors, medical reports detailing Art's injuries and health condition, Delia's testimony, and finally, the audio recording of Mikey's call to the emergency service. When the boy's desperate voice echoed through the room, "Please, my grandfather is dying. We're locked in a kennel in the rain." Many of those present lowered their eyes, unable to bear the despair in those words. Carol covered her face with her hands. Richard remained impassive. "Your Honor," concluded the district attorney, "we are facing one of the clearest cases of deliberate cruelty against an elderly person and a child that this court has ever witnessed. The defense can claim what they want, but the facts are irrefutable. Mr. Richard Mendez and his wife Carol subjected Arthur Mendez to inhumane conditions with the clear objective of accelerating his death and gaining total control over his assets. When discovered, they did not hesitate to subject their own son to the same cruelty. His strategy focused on the claim that Art suffered from dementia and posed a danger to himself, needing to be restrained. As for Mikey, he argued that the boy had been manipulated by his grandfather and needed strict discipline. But his words rang hollow in the face of the evidence presented, especially when it was Mikey's turn to testify. The boy walked to the witness stand, his legs trembling slightly. He stopped briefly as he passed the table where his parents were sitting. For the first time in weeks, he faced his father directly. There was no hatred in his gaze, just a deep sadness and something else, a maturity that no 10-year-old should possess. "Miguel Mendez," began the judge in a gentle voice, "do you understand why you are here today? Mikey, can you tell us how your grandfather was treated in your house?" "He begged sometimes," said Mikey, his voice cracking for the first time. He asked to come in just a little, just to warm up. My dad said he was lucky to have a roof over his head, that many old people were on the street. Fear that he would die, fear of my dad, and shame for not doing anything. There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet determination that the truth be known. "Didn't your father give you everything you wanted?" asked the attorney. "Toys, video games, expensive clothes." At the end of the day, the judge announced that he would make his decision on sentencing at the next session, but stated that temporary custody of Mikey would be granted to Delia with supervision by Deborah, while they assessed the possibility of Art assuming custody as soon as he fully recovered. When Mikey left the courthouse, a small crowd awaited him. People he didn't know wanted to shake his hand, take photos, congratulate him on his courage. The boy, uncomfortable with the attention, hid behind Deborah. "I don't like this," he whispered. "I didn't do anything special." "Do you think Grandpa can know what happened in court today?" he asked Deborah. She smiled, turning into the hospital entrance. "I think so. He's been making a lot of progress, hasn't he?" When he entered the room, he found his grandfather sitting in an armchair near the window, watching the sunset. He had gained some weight, his skin had a little color, and his eyes, the eyes were what had changed the most. They were shining again. "Grandpa!" exclaimed Mikey, running to hug him carefully. "My boy," replied Art in a weak but affectionate voice. "How did it go in court?" His grandfather listened in silence, occasionally squeezing his grandson's hand when the narrative became more difficult. "You know what the judge said in the end," Mikey concluded, "that as soon as you get better, we can live together again. Me and you." Together, they watched the sun disappear on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The worst was over. And although the road to full recovery was still long, for the first time in a long time, both felt something they had almost forgotten: hope. The small apartment in the Rose Garden neighborhood wasn't big or luxurious, but for Mikey and Art, it was paradise. 2 modest bedrooms, a cozy living room, a simple kitchen, and a small balcony where Art grew herbs in colorful pots. The morning light streamed generously through the windows, warming the space with a golden glow. 6 months had passed since the preliminary hearing. Richard and Carol were sentenced to 5 years in prison each, with an obligation to return part of the assets to their father. The construction company, now under judicial administration, continued to operate, generating income that supported Art and Mikey in their new home. On that Sunday morning, Mikey prepared breakfast while humming softly. At 10 years old, he had taken on responsibilities that children his age rarely knew. But contrary to what many feared, he hadn't lost his childhood. He had only developed a maturity that coexisted harmoniously with his childlike essence. "Grandpa, breakfast is ready," he called, setting the table carefully. Pancakes, orange juice, and the black coffee that his grandfather enjoyed so much. Art appeared leaning on his cane. He still had better and worse days, but overall his recovery had surprised everyone. He wore clean pajamas and had his white hair combed back. His eyes shone with renewed vitality. "Is all this for both of us?" he asked, looking at the lavish table. "You're going to end up making me fat, son." "Do we have visitors today?" he asked, watching the boy place another cup on the table. "Delia is coming to have lunch with us, remember? And Deborah might stop by later." And today, in an emotional ceremony at City Hall, Mayor Ed Martins officially inaugurated Project Art, a program for the protection and shelter of elderly people in vulnerable situations. Inspired by the case that moved our city a few months ago, the project will offer temporary housing, medical, psychological, and legal assistance to elderly victims of abandonment or family abuse. I never imagined that anything good could come of all that. You helped a lot of people without even knowing it, Grandpa. A story of overcoming adversity that has inspired an entire city to pay closer attention to its elderly. Mikey went back to eating his pancake, while Art seemed lost in thought. "Mikey," the old man finally called, "you never told me. Why didn't you give up on me? It would have been easier to stay quiet, obey your parents. You told me that story about the little warrior who faced the dragon to save the kingdom." Colorful banners hung from the trees, food stalls lined the sides, and a small stage had been set up in the center. A huge banner announced First Annual Community Day, Project Art. Hundreds of people circulated through the area, families with children, smiling seniors, volunteers in blue t-shirts. Mikey ran between the stalls holding a cotton candy almost bigger than his head. His eyes sparkled as he watched the musical performances, the craft workshops, and the games that took place simultaneously throughout the square. "Mikey, don't go too far," called Art, sitting in the shade of a large tree next to Delia. The boy waved, returning to his grandfather's side. He wore a Project Art t-shirt, as did hundreds of other people present. The event, organized to celebrate the first anniversary of the initiative, had become a true community celebration. "Grandpa, there's a painting workshop over there. Can we go?" he asked, pointing to a stall where elderly people and children painted side by side on large panels. Art smiled, rising with the help of his cane. A year of good nutrition, proper medical care, and above all, love and respect had worked miracles on his health. He wasn't the strong man he once was, and probably never would be again. But there was a restored dignity in his bearing, a sparkle of life in his eyes that no one could take away. "Of course we can," he replied, following his grandson with slow but steady steps. At the painting stall, a volunteer greeted them enthusiastically, offering brushes and colorful paints. Mikey quickly began to paint, his imagination flowing freely onto the paper. Art hesitated, contemplating the brush in his trembling hand. "I don't know if I still know how to do this," he murmured. "It's like riding a bike, Mr. Mendez," encouraged the volunteer. "You never really forget." Mikey watched his grandfather's drawing with admiration. "It's our house, Grandpa. It's beautiful." The crowd gathered to listen to him. "Exactly 1 year ago," he began, "we launched Project Art with a promise that no elderly person in our city would suffer neglect or abuse again. Today, we celebrate not only the results achieved, 47 seniors sheltered, 23 families reconciled, 12 lawsuits won, but also a change in mindset in our community. But we wouldn't be here," continued the mayor, "if it weren't for the extraordinary courage of 2 people. Their story has taught us that true strength isn't in muscles, power, or money. It's in the heart that refuses to accept injustice." Slowly, supported by his grandson's arm, Art climbed the steps of the stage. The crowd erupted in a standing ovation. Some people cried openly, others shouted words of thanks. "Mr. Mendez," said the mayor, handing him an envelope, "this is just a small gesture of recognition, an honorary citizen award and a full scholarship for Miguel, from elementary school through college." "Would you like to say a few words?" asked the mayor. The old man hesitated, looked at his grandson for courage, and then approached the microphone. I'm not good with words," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I've spent most of my life building things. Houses, buildings, bridges, things you can touch, see, use. I never imagined that my last construction would be this." He gestured, encompassing the entire square, all the people. "A project that isn't made of bricks and cement, but of hope and dignity." "But then," Art placed his hand on Mikey's shoulder, "this little warrior taught me that it's never too late to start over, that love can blossom in the most difficult circumstances, that courage has no age. And never ever give up fighting for dignity, yours and others." When they left the stage, they were surrounded by people who wanted to greet them, take photos, share stories. An elderly woman held Art's hand between hers. "Your story saved my life," she said in a choked voice. "My son was treating me badly, but I was ashamed to ask for help. After seeing what happened to you, I found the courage to call Project Art. Seniors who found their voice, families that reconciled, children who learned to value their grandparents. Art's pain, transformed into purpose, had created waves of change that extended far beyond what he could ever imagine. At the end of the afternoon, exhausted but happy, Mikey and Art walked slowly towards home. The sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with golden and purple hues. "Grandpa," Mikey called thoughtfully, "do you still feel angry at my dad? What I went through was terrible, yes, but if I could go back and change everything on the condition that you didn't exist in my life, I would choose to go through it all again 1,000 times just to have you as my grandson. Because without it, maybe we would never have discovered the strength we have together." Now he contemplated it as a free man, reborn through the love of a child who refused to give up on him. Life, thought Art, was truly mysterious in its ways. Sometimes you had to descend into hell to find redemption. Sometimes miracles came wrapped in the most unlikely packages, like a 10-year-old boy with the courage of a giant. "Let's go home, Grandpa," called Mikey, pulling his hand. "I promised Delia I'd make hot chocolate for everyone."